they found worms in his eye sockets, and he was still alive. No one screamed. Not the servant who first noticed the movement, not the physician who leaned closer with disbelief tightening his jaw, and certainly not the emperor himself. He lay still, as if the judgment were expected. A thin linen sheet clung to his sweat-slick skin, damp and faintly brown around the edges. His breath came in low, rattling chords, soft as prayer, cruel as punishment. The chamber stank of wax, rotting linen, and lavender oil, long since overpowered by something more organic, something older. Thick curtains, once embroidered with the Marian lilies, hung stiff with dust and time. Candles were lit at every corner of the room, not for reverence but because it masked the smell better than incense alone. The relics, bone splinters of saints, a splinter of the true cross, a mummified finger said to belong to Saint Sebastian, had been arranged around his bed like sentinels. But they did not protect him. The worm had been burrowing through the pinkish tissue beside his eye when the physician lifted the bandage. It was not alone. Two more, pale and slick with decay, were nestled in the moist hollow of his tear duct, where once a kingdom had gazed in fear and awe. He did not flinch. Instead, the Emperor Charles whispered, "Is it time for vespers?" And just like that, the spell held. The men in the room, the bishop, the attending noblemen, the herbalist who had wept into his own sleeves days earlier, nodded in unison, "Yes, Your Majesty. Yes, it is time." This was the fourth time that day he had asked the same question. His body had failed him months ago, but the schedule, the ritual, the sacred rhythm of the court, those still lived inside him, like marrow clinging to brittle bone. They had stopped cleaning the wounds on his legs. Every attempt led to more bleeding, more squirming. The ulcers returned faster than they could be drained. The bishop had called them stigmata. The court's silence called them something else. Rumors had started to coil like smoke through the halls of the Hofburg. That his suffering was not a test, but a verdict. That Charles had not been chosen by God, but marked by him. It had begun innocently, they said. Minor fevers, whispers of melancholy, sudden outbursts of religious fervor. The emperor had always been pious, but this had turned strange. He began kissing relics compulsively, scrubbing his hands until they bled, ordering fresh incense burned hourly, as though the air itself were impure. Then came the hallucinations, the dreams of saints with bleeding eyes, the visions of angels hovering at the end of his bed, whispering that his body must be perfectly purged. He had once awoken screaming that worms were beneath his skin, gnawing at his blood. At the time, they thought it madness. Now, they weren't so sure. He lay in a room lined with gold and velvet, surrounded by candles burning down to their wicks, and yet the throne of Austria had become a coffin in waiting. A servant removed the linen from the emperor's face. His skin had begun to separate from itself, cracking at the folds near his neck, revealing raw, sticky membranes. It had the look of something boiled, not born. His hair, once groomed to courtly perfection, was patchy and wet with pus. But his eyes, God, his eyes. One had gone cloudy weeks ago. The other remained somehow clear, flickering with lucid recognition even as his mind slipped deeper into delirium. That single eye tracked the bishop now as he lifted the crucifix to the emperor's lips. Charles kissed it without hesitation, leaving behind a smear of blood on the cold metal. The bishop did not wipe it off. Outside the palace, the empire was shifting. Spain's grip on Europe was weakening. The Ottoman threat returned in whispers. Inside court, lesser nobles murmured about succession, about whether God would allow such a death without taking the dynasty with it. Some prayed for a miracle. Others waited for him to die. But he did not die. Not quickly, not cleanly. He lingered. The royal physicians had exhausted every cure. Leeches, tinctures, prayer, even a so-called sacred bleeding performed on the feast of St. Lazarus. Nothing worked. The worms remained. The flesh refused to heal. He had ordered no mirrors in the palace, not since he caught a glimpse of himself during Easter Mass, his robes soaked through with sweat, his face pale and sagging, as though gravity itself had turned against him. They told him it was divine trial, that he would be raised up like Job. He believed them, and yet the empire could smell his death before it arrived. The Archbishop of Mainz had refused to enter the capital for months, citing miasmas of plague. The Venetian ambassador wrote privately that His Majesty is embalming himself before he is buried. Even the Pope, in his correspondence, offered prayers that were past tense. But inside the chamber, time bent around Charles's will. Vespers followed lauds, and lauds followed matins. The bell chimed each hour, and the priests chanted, and the emperor, rotting by degrees, answered every call. When his lips could no longer form words, he mouthed them. When his tongue began to split, he simply listened. It was as though the ritual alone was keeping him alive, or keeping him from crossing some terrible, irreversible threshold. And the empire, like the man, decayed with quiet ceremony. For Charles, death would not be an ending. It would be an unveiling of everything the incense had hidden, of everything the saints had failed to bless. The worms would not wait. And God, if he still watched, was doing so through closed fingers. Before the rot set in, before the ulcers bled through silk, before the worms came, Charles VI was not a corpse in waiting. He was an emperor, a man of precision, of pageantry, of unshakable conviction. In portraits, his face was pale and impassive, his eyes always slightly narrowed as if evaluating the worth of the world. He rarely smiled. His courtiers said he didn't need to. His presence was enough. Born into the House of Habsburg, Charles was steeped in the doctrine of divine monarchy from the moment he took his first breath. He was not merely a ruler, he was a vessel of God's will, a mortal spine carrying the weight of celestial order. His crown wasn't just forged of gold, it was forged of duty, prophecy, and sacrament. Every gesture, every decree, every word spoken beneath the high ceilings of his court was offered like a liturgy. He kept a crucifix in every room, not one, but many, each chosen for a different mood, a different hour, a different burden. There were relics embedded in his walls, in his rings, in the gilded handles of his writing quills. In his private chapel, he kept a vial said to contain a drop of Christ's blood, and he once refused to eat for 3 days because a visiting bishop questioned its authenticity. Charles was obsessed with divine symmetry. Every element of his court had to mirror God's order. The candles had to be lit in sevens. The altar linens had to be changed on Thursdays, never Wednesdays. He slept facing east, always, even when it meant moving the entire bed frame during winter. His diet was dictated by feast days, fast days, and obscure liturgical observances that even the monks had to consult twice. He saw patterns in everything. When his dog died on the day of St. Apollonia, patron of toothaches, he ordered all royal dentists to abstain from practice for a full week. When lightning struck a nearby church spire, he fasted for 9 days and ordered the court painter to recreate the scene, convinced it was a sign that his enemies were plotting with the devil. But his true devotion was to relics. Charles VI didn't just collect them, he communed with them. A sliver of St. Catherine's rib hung above his bed. He wore a ring said to contain the breath of St. Ambrose, encased in glass so small it could not be confirmed. He traveled with a bone fragment from St. Lawrence, sewn into the lining of his robes, and when war was declared, he would press it to his chest and whisper Latin verses for protection. The court mocked it behind closed doors. Some said he believed in the relics more than he believed in God. Others said he was trying to become one, trying to turn his own body into a sacred object, one that could resist death, disease, or doubt. His rule was iron wrapped in velvet. Publicly gentle, privately ruthless. He had spies within the clergy. He rewrote monastic rules. He tightened the leash around Catholic orthodoxy with surgical precision, not out of cruelty, but out of holy obligation. Protestant whispers were treated like fire, not yet consuming, but always capable of spreading. He feared the Reformation not because it threatened his policies, but because it threatened the metaphysical scaffolding of his world. To Charles, illness was never random. It was always a consequence, a rift in divine order. When his sister fell ill with fever, he refused medicine and ordered a month-long novena. When she died, he dismissed the physicians and increased the penance. God had been insulted. The bloodline had been weakened. The body must be made holy again. He kept his own body like a monastery. Baths were rare, sacred rituals reserved for certain feast days. He believed too much heat opened the flesh to sin. He would wear hair shirts under royal robes, allowing them to itch and burn against his skin while receiving foreign dignitaries. He considered pain a sign of closeness to God. Court physicians despaired of him. He refused common remedies, would not take tinctures unless they were blessed, believed in leeches but only if applied during the hours of the Virgin. More than once, his stubborn piety brought him to the edge of collapse, but each time he survived, he took it as proof. God was preserving him for something greater, and his empire, for a time, reflected this fanatic devotion. Ceremonies were endless. Processions wound through Vienna like arteries. Bells rang for every occasion. Mass was no longer an event, it was an atmosphere. To step into his palace was to step into a cathedral. Visitors spoke in hushed tones. Soldiers crossed themselves before delivering news. The marble halls echoed not just with authority, but with awe. But awe is not the same as strength. Even as the empire glowed with religious fervor, cracks were spreading. The coffers ran dry, nobles grumbled, borders blurred. The rituals grew longer as the alliances grew thinner. Charles prayed louder, knelt longer, gave more to the church. Yet still the shadows pressed in. It was as if his faith grew more desperate with every passing year, like a man praying not out of love, but fear. Fear that God had already decided. Fear that his body, the holy instrument of divine rule, was beginning to fail. And then, one day, he stumbled during Mass. Just a tremor, a momentary sway. But the court noticed, the priest noticed, Charles noticed. He gripped the pew, forced a smile, whispered a psalm, and continued the ceremony. But something had changed. The emperor, who once stood like a statue carved from conviction, now trembled like wax near fire. That was the beginning. The day ritual lost its shield. The day the relics stopped working. The day the holy order he'd spent his life building, candles, chants, censers, crowns, began to crack. He had believed himself chosen, holy, preserved. But the body does not care. And soon, neither would God. It began with a headache. Not a common ache brought on by stress or sleeplessness, but something sharper, deeper, something that made the light itself unbearable. Charles VI would sit in the dark for hours. Face turned to the corner of the room like a penitent, whispering fragments of Latin verses to no one in particular. The physicians called them noble humors. The priests called them visits from the divine. But the servants, the ones who had to clean the linens soaked with sweat and bile, began to whisper another word. punishment. He began washing his hands obsessively, not with soap, which he distrusted as an alchemical poison, but with water drawn before dawn, always from the same silver basin, always chilled with ice. He would rub his fingers raw, the skin between them flaking like parchment. He claimed it was purification, that Saint Bernard had once done the same before receiving visions. His confessor urged him to moderate the practice, but Charles only nodded absently and demanded that all doors and books be cleaned with vinegar. At first, the court mistook it for devotion, another layer of his monastic severity. But it escalated. He wouldn't touch anything that hadn't been blessed. He wouldn't eat unless the cook recited the creed over the meal. He burned his own gloves when he believed they had been spiritually soiled by contact with a Protestant merchant. When a page boy sneezed during prayer, Charles ordered him to fast for 3 days, not as punishment, he said, but to restore divine balance. The headaches worsened. He would double over mid-sentence, clutching his skull, gasping as though he were being stabbed from within. At times, he swore he heard music during the pain, chanting but twisted, like psalms sung backward. No one else could hear it. When the bishop insisted he was merely exhausted, Charles accused him of lacking faith. Then came the first abscess, a small swelling on the inside of his thigh, red, tender, the size of a coin. He refused to have it lanced. "Let it open on God's time," he said. When it did, weeks later the room filled with a smell so foul the servants retched in the hallway. Charles simply closed his eyes and whispered thanks, calling it a chalice of pain passed to me by Christ himself. More followed, behind his knees, under his arms, at the base of his spine. Some burst on their own. Others had to be drained, though he would allow only priests, not doctors, to witness the process. He called the pus holy ichor. One morning, when he awoke to find blood pooled beneath his sheets, he refused to let the bedding be washed. "This," he said, "is the true relic." By now, he rarely left his chambers. When he did, it was with a veil over his face, muttering prayers with every step, pausing every few feet to cross himself. He developed rituals for walking, 3 steps forward, 1 back. He claimed it mirrored the journey of the Israelites in the wilderness. No one argued. They simply waited. The court began to shift around him. Ministers would whisper in adjacent rooms rather than risk disturbing him. Masses were shortened. The music softened. A growing discomfort took root in the palace, a sense that something was unraveling behind closed doors, something festering beneath the veil of piety. One night, a servant was found crying in the hallway, her apron stained with something dark. When asked what happened, she only said, "He smiled at me, but it wasn't him." She left the next morning. No one asked her name. The physicians were summoned again, this time secretly. They examined what they could, under layers of linen in shadowed corners, always under Charles's suspicious gaze. Their conclusions were whispered, sealed in envelopes, burned. One young doctor simply said, "It's not his body I'm afraid of, it's his certainty." And still, Charles insisted it was a divine test. He likened himself to Job, to Saint Sebastian, even to Christ. The pain, the sores, the humiliation, none of it shook his faith. If anything, it strengthened it. He began writing hymns from his sickbed, dictated to trembling scribes who had to pause between stanzas to wipe blood from the floor. He refused opiates, refused even wine. He fasted more often, slept less, demanded more relics be brought in. When told that a new saint's finger had arrived from Naples, he wept with joy and demanded it be placed near the wound on his chest. "Let him see," Charles said, "what faith can endure." It was no longer about ruling. The affairs of the empire were delegated, delayed, dismissed. Letters from generals went unopened. Ambassadors returned home empty-handed. Charles had become a man consumed by a private theology, one where pain equaled purity, where decay was a mark of election, not decline. The abscesses now covered most of his torso. Some bled continuously. Others crusted over in unnatural colors. A second worm was found, this time in the folds of his scalp. Charles was unfazed. "Even the saints were eaten," he whispered. At night he would pray aloud for hours, chanting names of martyrs, recounting visions no one else saw. He spoke of angels with rotted wings, of heavenly battles fought inside his blood. One night he claimed the Virgin herself had visited him, holding a basin of worms and saying, "This is the price." The few who still attended him began to believe it, not in the visions perhaps, but in the possibility that his body had become a battleground for something larger, something invisible. The line between madness and sanctity blurred, then vanished. By winter, Charles's sheets were never clean. His body wept from wounds both fresh and ancient. He could barely sit upright, but his voice remained strong, measured, clear, terrifying in its conviction. When asked how he bore it, he simply smiled and said, "Because it is mine, my suffering, my altar, my crown." And no one dared take it from him. They began bathing him in relics. Every morning, as the bells tolled prime, a procession of priests would enter the emperor's chamber, their faces pale with incense and fear. One carried a box of reliquaries, finger bones wrapped in gold, splinters from the true cross, cloth flecked with the blood of forgotten martyrs. Another bore holy water fetched before dawn, blessed 3 times, then passed through 7 silver basins, as Charles had commanded. They surrounded his bed like monks at a tomb. The wounds had multiplied. Some pulsed with infection, others had gone black. The skin on his legs had begun to peel, revealing meat like bruised fruit. The ulcers under his arms oozed constantly, staining the sheets despite daily changes. The stink was overwhelming, but Charles only blinked slowly, like a man bored by his own death. "This one," he murmured once, pointing to a sore the size of a coin near his hip, "was given by St. George. I dreamed of him. He touched me with his spear. That's where it entered." He was convinced they were signs, that each affliction had been lovingly applied by a celestial hand, not to punish him, but to refine him, scrape away the soft flesh of doubt until only sacred bone remained. The priests didn't contradict him. They prayed louder. Psalms echoed through the chamber like incantations. Relics were pressed against his open sores with gloved hands. The bloodied cloths were folded and burned. A chalice was placed beside his bed, not for wine, but to collect whatever his body expelled. It filled too quickly. And still Charles spoke of visions. He claimed St. Lucy appeared to him at dawn, offering her own gouged eyes on a plate. He said he had heard the wings of archangels beating inside the walls. He believed the room itself had become a sanctuary, that the rot was proof of sanctification. When the worms came again, nesting near his groin, he smiled. "They are not punishment," he said to his confessor. "They are trials. Each one carries a lesson." The confessor asked what the lesson was. Charles stared at the ceiling for a full minute before replying, "That the flesh is the first lie." He no longer accepted the sacraments in the usual form. Instead, he demanded they be dissolved in water and poured over his wounds. "My mouth is unworthy," he whispered. "Let the host find another way in." The archbishop protested. Charles refused him entry for 3 days. When he was finally allowed back in, the emperor greeted him with a single phrase, "Even Christ bled in private." By now, no physician would treat him directly. Their hands were replaced by monks, herbalists, and apothecaries who barely understood what they were seeing. Salves turned the flesh green. Oils smoked when applied. The sores multiplied. And still, Charles demanded the rituals continue. If they missed an hour, he would weep, not from pain, but from fear that the divine order had been disrupted. One morning, when a storm delayed the arrival of a relic procession, he accused the thunder of being a reprimand from the Virgin. He demanded penance from the entire court. 5 nobles whipped themselves in the courtyard under a rain-soaked cross. The priests, exhausted and half-starved, began to falter. Some forgot the psalms, others skipped the relic rotation. One collapsed mid-prayer, and Charles simply nodded and said he was not worthy. The emperor's mind remained sharp, terrifyingly so. He remembered every prayer, every passage, every symbol. He would correct priests mid-verse, berate scribes for miscopying Latin, demand that icons be rehung by an inch to the east. He controlled his death like he had once controlled his empire, down to the second, down to the stitch. But the body betrayed him. His tongue blackened, his teeth loosened. His breath soured to the point that even the priests, trained to endure the stench of the grave, turned their faces away. Still, the rituals went on, because without them there was nothing left. The empire waited in silence. No decrees were issued, no treaties signed. Ministers stood in cold corridors waiting for an audience that would never come. The throne room remained lit but empty. Spiders nested in the corners. Dust thickened on the armrests. The emperor had become both relic and ruin. He ordered his own funeral hymns rehearsed at night, just outside his window, claimed it soothed him, claimed he could hear the angels humming along. Once, a servant tripped while bringing in a basin of anointed oil. It shattered. The room fell silent. Charles turned slowly, maggots trailing down the inside of his sleeve, and whispered, "Even Judas stumbled." The servant was never seen again. In his final days, the rituals became more violent. Leeches were applied to his temples. His feet were wrapped in strips of parchment covered in scripture. Incense burned until the tapestries singed. The priests sang until their voices cracked. He believed the worms were saints in disguise, that they whispered lessons no man could hear. And when one of them fell from his ear and wriggled onto the pillow, he picked it up with trembling fingers and held it to his eye. "Tell me," he said, "what have I not yet learned?" No one moved, not even God. They smelled him before they saw him. Even the thickest veils of incense, resin from Jerusalem, frankincense from Carthage, myrrh scraped from the bones of Egyptian trees, could not mask the truth anymore. The emperor was rotting, not metaphorically, not spiritually. His body had begun the process of decomposition while he was still awake, still speaking, still directing the rites of his own decay like a maestro in the final movement of a requiem. The corridors outside his chamber were lined with bowls of lavender and mint. Windows were thrown open despite the winter air. Candles burned day and night, perfumed wax melting into ornate brass holders. Still, nothing worked. The smell moved like a second presence through the palace. It clung to curtains, sank into floorboards, bled into the pages of holy books. Those who stood watch at his door returned to their quarters with the scent trapped in their clothes, an invisible mark that set them apart. They were called the Anointed, but not in reverence, in pity. Inside the chamber, the air was a war, a battle between sanctity and corruption. One moment filled with sacred smoke, the next with the stench of something fouler than death, a rot too intimate for the tomb, too fresh, too alive. Charles VI no longer noticed. He would smile through blackened lips, wave dismissively at the incense bearers, and croak, "Don't waste it, the saints aren't fooled." His breath had soured to the point that priests confessed behind linen screens, afraid to inhale too deeply as he spoke of visions and divine blueprints burned into his wounds. The symbolism deepened daily. Each morning he demanded his favorite relic, a shard of St. Euphemia's femur, be pressed against his chest, directly over the wound that now oozed a dark syrup smelling of rust and meat. When the relic stuck to the skin, no one moved to remove it. They let it fall on its own. One priest, desperate to mask the stench, began dousing himself in consecrated oil before entering. Charles mistook it for sweat and whispered, "Fear sweetens the devout." The priest fainted not long after, his body unable to reconcile the scent of grace with the stench of decomposition. The emperor's back had opened. That was the phrase the monks used, opened, as if by divine hand. The skin split down the spine like rotted fruit, revealing muscle gray with rot, clotted with what looked like tar. The bedding had to be replaced twice daily. The staff burned the linens in secret, not out of hygiene, but out of dread that the decay might spread like heresy. And still, Charles sang. At dusk, as the sun slid past the stained glass, casting wounds of crimson and violet across the stone walls, he would chant the psalms in a broken voice. They weren't always the right ones. Sometimes he merged verses. Sometimes he added names of saints that had never existed. But no one corrected him, because by then everyone had begun to believe what he believed, that this was no illness. This was revelation. His body had become a cathedral of rot. His wounds, each a stained glass window of divine judgment. His blood, the new incense. His stench, the smell of God's reckoning. No one could say it aloud, but they knew. Somewhere deep in their bones, the truth had settled like frost. Charles was being transformed, not into an angel, not into a relic, but into something older, something that bore witness to the moment before grace, when fear was the only path to God. Visitors no longer lingered. The ambassadors left messages rather than audience requests. Even his own children refused to enter the chamber. His daughter wept outside the door for 3 hours, begging to be spared the memory. She never returned. Only the most devout remained, and even they began to waver. One monk vomited during Vespers. Another dropped the Eucharist when a worm crawled from the emperor's ear mid-blessing. The archbishop, once unshakable, now trembled each time Charles spoke his name. "You cannot bear the smell," Charles said one morning, "because you have not yet wept for your sins." That same afternoon, a candle caught the edge of a tapestry and nearly engulfed the chamber in flame. Charles didn't flinch. "Let it burn," he said. "The soul must be boiled to be made clean." The tapestry survived, barely, but the mark it left on the wall, black, jagged, spreading upward like smoke, remained. No one tried to paint over it. The air grew thicker with every passing day. Less air than memory. A reminder of every sacred lie whispered in perfumed cathedrals. The scent of incense could no longer compete. It became an afterthought, a whimpering presence against the roar of bodily judgment. The rot had taken his eyes. They filmed over, then darkened, then sunk into themselves. One socket bled, the other birthed a pale worm, which Charles held in his palm for several minutes before releasing it onto his chest. "It seeks light," he said. "Don't we all?" Even the choir changed. Where once they sang soaring hymns of triumph and purity, they now sang lower, slower. Lamentations. Minor keys. The music no longer reached for heaven, it circled the room like mourning, and yet he ruled. Through stench, through ruin, through the silence of a court too terrified to leave and too devout to disobey, he ruled. Each ritual still happened, each psalm still sung, because to stop would mean admitting that God was no longer watching, or worse, that he was, and this was his answer. When asked why he would not allow them to close the chamber door, Charles replied, "So the world may learn the smell of truth." No one asked again. The flies came not just as visitors, but as heirs. First, they hovered, drawn to the sweet decay of human ruin. Then they nested, burrowed, bred, laid eggs in the folds of dead skin as if it were consecrated soil. The body of Charles VI had become not only a sanctuary but a cradle for corruption. They bred beneath his ribs. When the monks peeled away the gauze wrappings from his abdomen, they found movement. Not worms this time, but larvae. Dozens of them, squirming like blind prophets, chewing through what flesh remained. One monk dropped the cloth and ran. He was never seen again. Another fainted with the words "possession" still forming on his lips. The priests gathered that night to pray. Not over Charles, but for themselves. Because the sacred and the grotesque had become indistinguishable. His room smelled not of death anymore, but of something worse. Birth. Birth of what, no one could say. But something was being ushered in, and it had no place in the kingdom of man. Flies buzzed around the altar at the foot of his bed. They landed on relics, on scripture, on the host itself. One was found drowned in the holy water. Another crawled across the open Gospel of John mid-reading, its legs smeared with blood. Still, the emperor smiled. "They bring messages," he said. "They are heaven's lesser angels." His confessor, Father Albrecht, said nothing, but he recorded it in his journal, then burned the page. Each night the emperor asked to be read the Passion, and each night Albrecht watched as flies gathered at the corners of his mouth, licking the dried sores with slow reverence. He tried once to swat them away. Charles grabbed his wrist with a strength no one thought remained. "Do not disturb the holy ones," he whispered. "They come for the truth beneath my tongue." Albrecht began to question everything. Was this man still Charles VI, Roman Emperor, defender of the faith? Or had something entered him, slipped through the wounds, burrowed through the rituals, worn the mask of piety like a second skin? He brought his concerns to the archbishop, spoke of infestation, of hallucinations, of the emperor claiming he could hear the insects pray. The archbishop listened in silence, then asked, "Does he blaspheme?" Albrecht hesitated. "He believes the worms are saints." "That is not blasphemy," the archbishop replied. "It is mystery." Albrecht returned to the chamber with a weight behind his eyes. He no longer wore his collar. He no longer opened the windows. He sat in silence at Charles's side and listened to the flies buzz like a hymn of rot. By now, the court no longer entered. Messengers left scrolls at the door and fled. Pages whispered that the walls inside were damp with something that wasn't water. A carpenter tasked with repairing a window refused to enter, saying the wood inside the chamber breathed when touched. Charles had stopped speaking Latin. Now he spoke in a language no one could identify. Fragmented syllables, backward vowels, nonsense that made the monk's skin crawl. When asked what he was saying, he replied, "The tongue of the womb, the language of creation, the sound the angels made when they first saw flesh." The priests argued behind closed doors. Some believed he was sanctified. Others feared demonic possession. But none dared exorcise him. Because what if it wasn't a demon? What if it was God? What if holiness had decayed, and this was what remained? Albrecht wept. He wept while bandaging the emperor's legs, which were now hollowed like burned logs. He wept while reading scripture through clouds of flies. He wept when Charles asked, "If the body is a temple, what happens when the temple begins to speak?" Because the flies weren't just feeding, they were listening. And Charles began to speak directly to them. He told them stories, gave them names, claimed one was the spirit of his father, another the messenger of Saint Sebastian. They gathered on his chest like acolytes. One landed on his tongue and remained there for minutes. Albrecht wanted to scream. Instead, he opened the psalter and whispered, "Lord, make me blind." He thought of confessing everything, telling Rome, writing to the Pope, calling the Inquisition. But what would he report? That God had returned in the form of rot? That sainthood now came with buzzing wings and larval breath? And worse, what if it was true? The grotesque was now sacred. The sacred grotesque. Relics no longer gleamed. They were blood-stained and crawling. Scripture pages stuck together from the moisture in the room. Chalices rusted overnight. The Eucharist turned black if left too long. And Charles, beloved Charles, believed it all divine. "I am not dying," he told Albrecht one night. "I am molting. When the skin falls away, you'll see what God has made of me." Albrecht did not sleep that night. He watched as flies nested in the emperor's open wounds, as larvae pulsed against the rib cage. He watched as Charles prayed in his unknown tongue, his eyes gone, his voice now more insect than man. The next morning, the confessor shaved his own head and burned his robes. And still, he returned. Because if this was a heresy, it was a holy one. They came in white robes and trembling hands, not as healers, but as witnesses. Physicians summoned from Vienna, Prague, and the far reaches of Bavaria. Men who had dissected plague victims, who had stitched battlefield wounds, who had once boiled a man's blood just to prove the devil couldn't survive fire. But none of them had seen this. They called it a sacred affliction, a divine rot, a punishment wrapped in sanctity. And so they treated it like scripture, read it, misread it, rewrote it. The first remedy was leeches. Dozens of them placed behind his ears, along his neck, under his arms. Each fattened with blood that was too dark, too thick, too warm. When the last one dropped from his chest and curled into a dead spiral, the physician crossed himself and whispered, "It rejects cleansing." Next came arsenic, crushed and mixed with honey. They spread it across his gums with a golden spoon. Charles screamed, not because of the poison, but because the honey reminded him of spring. And spring, he said, was for the untested. The sweetness repulsed him more than the burning. His tongue blistered. The blackened sore that opened across his lower lip never closed again. Then came the blessed blood. Drawn from a virgin nun who had been kept in prayer for 9 days, her body scrubbed with hyssop and sealed in silence. The blood was warm when it touched his lips, and he moaned, not from pleasure, but recognition. "This is familiar," he said. "It tastes like when I was loved." The bishop, anointing his feet, broke down in tears. Still, the wounds deepened. Still, the room pulsed with the rhythm of infestation. One night, they tried something older, something forbidden. A dead dove, split down the center, was placed over his heart. The ritual was whispered in Latin and Old Bavarian. Charles opened one eye, milky, half collapsed, and asked, "Is it white because it's pure, or because it's blind?" The dove died again in his hands, and he held it for hours. The physicians debated openly. One believed the emperor's marrow had turned to oil. Another argued it was his soul that had soured, leaking upward through the blood like smoke through stone. A third insisted they had all mistaken holiness for infection, and that no medicine could treat a man so close to God. Still, they cut him. They lanced abscesses the size of apples. They drained fluid so thick it clung to their blades. One opened a cyst and found it filled with tiny bones, not human, not animal, just enough to unsettle. Another swore he saw a face inside one wound, grinning up at him like a reflection in a dark well. Charles bore it all in silence, until he didn't. One morning, after being forced to swallow a tincture of lead and sage, he screamed so loud the stone walls echoed for hours. He begged for a vision, clawed at his own face, tore open a scab on his brow, and wept when no light came from the wound. "Where is he?" he cried. "Where's the fire? The hand? The scroll? Why do you feed me poison and call it prayer?" The priests retreated. The physicians whispered of madness, of spiritual sickness, of the line between king and prophet being finally, irrevocably crossed. But no one left, because to leave was to abandon God, or worse, to admit he was not there at all. That night, Charles had a seizure. His limbs thrashed like rope in a storm. Foam sprayed from his mouth. Flies scattered, then returned, dancing across his chest like black confetti. When he stilled, he whispered, "They're in my dreams now. They build little churches beneath my tongue." They tried trepanation, drilling into his skull to release the sacred pressure. They did it over prayers, over incense. The bone cracked, the skin peeled back, and what poured out was not blood, but a dark, syrupy fluid that hissed when it hit the floor. Still, he did not die. The lead healer looked into the emperor's eyes and saw movement, not twitching, not pain, but direction, as if something inside was watching back. That same night, Charles asked to see the Virgin. He was brought a painting, centuries old, framed in gold and kissed by hundreds. He turned his head away. "No, the real one. I need to see what flesh looks like before it's touched by worms." They called for the relics. St. Catherine's finger, St. John's jawbone, the blood-soaked sash of a forgotten martyr. He looked at them all and whispered, "These were men like me, hollowed for glory, but glory never came." The next morning, the flies returned to his mouth. Not crawling, flying, as if the body had become a hive. He did not flinch. He opened his mouth wider and whispered, "Let them speak." The physicians began praying not for healing, but for permission to leave. They were denied. Charles no longer responded to treatment. When given salt water to cleanse his wounds, he drank it and said, "This is what the sea will taste like when it drinks the dead." When offered communion, he laughed, a slow, broken sound, and said, "Bread only feeds the living." They tried one final remedy. A cloth soaked in the blood of a murdered child, kept hidden by a cult of monks who believed pain could be reversed by pain. The cloth was wrapped around his chest. He convulsed for 3 hours, then stopped breathing entirely. The room froze. Then, just as they were about to declare him dead, he inhaled, shallow, sharp, alive. "I saw something," he said. They leaned in. "I asked for a vision. It gave me wings, but not white ones, not feathers, not light, just flies, black flies, forever." And then he smiled, not because he was comforted, but because he finally understood what waited. The body had not yet gone cold, but the empire had already begun to break. By the time Charles VI exhaled his final breath, if one could call it that, a gasp that carried with it the odor of something older than rot, the court was emptying. Servants vanished without formal dismissal. Nobles slipped away under pretense of illness or grief. Even the guards abandoned their posts, claiming the air in the palace made their teeth ache and their dreams spiral into nightmares. Word moved faster than any official decree. The emperor had died devoured. Some said it was disease. Others whispered judgment. But most clung to the version that spread through taverns and back halls like spilled wine, that Charles had been consumed by his own holiness, that the relics had feasted on him, and that the throne now bore the curse of a god who had changed his mind. Panic set in among the aristocracy. Those closest to succession began to distance themselves, publicly and symbolically. The Archduke refused to touch the Emperor's ring when it was offered. A Bavarian cousin declined to enter the cathedral for the funeral, citing unresolved spiritual conflict. The Spanish court sent no ambassador. The French king sent condolences, and soldiers to the border. Inside the empire, power splintered. Each duchy claimed the death was divine punishment, but for someone else's sins. Hungary blamed Vienna's decadence. Bohemia blamed Jesuit overreach. The Austrians blamed the Protestants. The Protestants blamed the emperor, and the church blamed no one, yet tightened its grip. In the vacuum left behind, ghosts began to speak. Not literal ones, though there were those who claimed to see flies where none should be, or hear voices in the corridors at night, but political ghosts, failed alliances, buried scandals, forgotten heirs. Names that had been scrubbed from court ledgers resurfaced. Half-siblings born in secret were now declared legitimate. Bastards appeared in royal garments. Priests revised family trees mid-sermon. The official succession line was no longer clear. It had been once. Charles had a daughter, Maria Theresa, intelligent and composed, raised to lead, but never officially crowned, and never without opposition. Now her enemies emerged with mouths full of prophecy and parchment. They questioned her blood, her sex, her silence during Charles's decay. They cited ancient laws and whispered even older curses. One Hungarian count claimed that to accept a woman now was to invite the same rot that had hollowed the throne. The Habsburg unity began to snap. One noble in Moravia raised his own banner. Another in Silesia claimed direct guidance from a vision of the Archangel Michael, declaring the court impure and Vienna the mouth of the beast. Letters arrived in Rome begging the Pope to denounce false claimants, while others pleaded for exorcisms instead of coronations. Inside the palace, the body remained. It had been placed in a sealed, lead-lined casket, but still the air turned sour. Mourners collapsed mid-prayer. The bishop presiding over the funeral mass began to bleed from his nose. The choir coughed in unison, as if choking on invisible smoke. One deacon vomited when the incense failed to mask the stench. They said it was grief, but behind closed doors, they called it infestation. No embalmer would touch the corpse. When one was found willing, an old monk blinded in one eye, he lasted only minutes in the chamber. He emerged whispering, it was smiling. Then he collapsed and died within the week. Maria Theresa visited the chamber once. She did not enter. She stood at the threshold, eyes rimmed in black lace, and stared at the door. Then she turned to her advisor and said, "Whatever he became, it ends here." She ordered the entire wing sealed. The stone was scorched, the walls anointed, the tapestries burned, and still, the servants claimed to hear the hum of flies beyond the brick. Her claim to the throne was made official a week later, but not by acclamation. It was forged by necessity. The empire, now unraveling, needed a figurehead. And so Maria Theresa was crowned not with celebration, but with fear. Bells tolled half-heartedly. Streets remained half-empty. And the priests wore gloves to bless the oils. Outside the palace, statues of Charles VI were defaced. Some were beheaded, others smeared with red pitch. In Graz, someone placed a rotten deer carcass at the feet of the emperor's likeness, with a note pinned to its flank, "Flies belong to him now." The memory of Charles turned toxic. His decrees were revised, his likeness quietly removed from court portraits. His final letters, rambling and filled with phrases like "the wings of saints" and "the language of hunger," were locked away, labeled apocryphal, too dangerous for the public. But they still leaked, and with them came the legend. Fishermen along the Danube claimed his ghost rode the river's mist, cloaked in insects. Children born with birthmarks were said to be kissed by Charles. A sect of monks in Salzburg began praying to him, believing he had transcended death and become a vessel for divine judgment. The church intervened swiftly. They denied any sanctification, declared the rumors heresy, burned the Salzburg monastery to ash and salted the ground beneath it. Still, the myth grew, because myths grow fastest in cracks. And Charles had left more than one. He had ruled with ceremony, with hierarchy, with divine order, and then died as a horror, untamed and unsaintly. The contradiction ruptured everything. Because if an emperor, chosen by God, could rot alive and call it holy, what did that mean for the empire he left behind? In taverns, they stopped toasting his name. In cathedrals, priests avoided sermons about divine favor. In the hearts of the people, something shifted. And in the hidden corners of the Habsburg court, flies still buzzed. Not just in memory, not just in rumor, but in the darkness between rooms, where no one dared sweep. They waited until the third night to bring the sacrament, not because they had forgotten, and not because they lacked courage, but because no one was sure if the emperor was still, in any sense, a man. By then, he no longer spoke in full sentences, only fragments, delivered through cracked lips that trembled with fever. His body had become unrecognizable beneath the robes. The cloth stuck to his skin, soaked through with a mixture of pus, blood, and something darker. No one dared remove it. The linen had fused to him like a second flesh. His breathing came in wet rattles, like water boiling in a closed jar. Every exhale left the room thicker, heavier. The scent of rot no longer faded with incense. It merged with it. Priests began vomiting between prayers. Confessors wept between litanies. One acolyte passed out and struck his head on the altar steps. And still, the emperor lived. On the morning of the final rites, the bells rang out across Vienna, not in mourning, not yet, but in preparation. The city held its breath. The court sealed its doors. Those brave enough to enter the chamber did so with candles, crucifixes, and cloth over their mouths. A bishop was summoned from Salzburg, a man known for steady hands, for faith unshaken even by plague and famine. He knelt beside the bed. His mouth formed the Latin rites. He lifted the anointing oil, sanctified by years of use and locked away for kings only. But when he touched it to Charles's forehead, something crawled out. A maggot, fat, white, glistening with the heat of infection, emerged from beneath the emperor's left eyelid. Then another, then three. They fell into the oil dish. The bishop dropped it. The metal clanged against the stone floor, and the priests gasped as the holy chrism mixed with the filth. The emperor stirred. Only slightly. Only enough for his mouth to part. And from that mouth more fell. Larvae, bile, the dark sludge of internal decay. One priest screamed and fled the room. Another began praying louder, faster, trying to drown out the wet noise of collapse. Charles blinked once. Then, through cracked teeth and swollen tongue, he whispered, God will not take me whole. It was not a curse, nor a lament. It was an observation, cold and final, as if he had resigned himself to the possibility that holiness was selective and that parts of him had already been judged unworthy. The bishop tried to continue. He dipped a new cloth in oil, reached again. This time, he managed to mark the emperor's chest in the shape of a cross. But the skin split beneath his fingers. Blood, so dark it looked purple, spilled down the ribs. It hissed when it touched the stone. Charles exhaled, but did not die. The priests brought in the crucifix, a relic carved from a dead martyr's tree said to have healed plague victims in Bohemia. They laid it at the foot of the bed. One whispered, "May he see himself in you." Another muttered, "Let this be the mirror." Charles reached for it. Slowly, painfully. His arms lifted, not gracefully, not evenly, but enough to mimic the pose. Outstretched, palms upward, eyes open. A parody of Christ on the cross. His head tilted back. Blood spilled from his ears. His jaw trembled, then slackened. His body spasmed, once, twice, then froze. For a moment, it looked like ecstasy. For a moment, it looked like absolution, but only for a moment, because the wounds did not stop leaking, because the flies did not flee, because the room did not go silent. One priest fainted. The bishop backed away, and Charles, crucified in filth, died with his eyes wide open. There was no light, no warmth, no celestial scent, only the sound of dripping, only the smell of final judgment, only the echo of his own words, still trembling on every tongue. God will not take me whole. The chamber was sealed within hours. Lime was poured along the thresholds. Salt scattered in the shape of crosses. The emperor's body, what remained of it, was encased in lead and iron, then buried not beneath the cathedral, but far from it. Not in the earth's embrace, but in a vault suspended in chains, as if even the grave refused to touch him. And still, the worms returned. Not to the flesh, they had already consumed their portion, but to the minds of those who remained, to the priests who couldn't pray without gagging, to the nobles who woke in the night thinking they heard the buzz of flies beneath the floorboards, to the daughter who inherited the empire with trembling hands and a chamber no one dared unseal. In the end, what did it mean? Was it judgment? A curse disguised as ritual? A man's obsessive faith turning inward until it consumed him? Or was it something older, more human? A parable carved in rotting flesh. That power insulated from truth, that rule wrapped in incense and delusion, becomes a coffin before its time. That to believe oneself chosen is the first step toward being forsaken. Because Charles VI was not a tyrant, not in the traditional sense. He didn't drown his enemies in rivers. He didn't burn cities or defile temples. He prayed, he fasted. He believed in relics, saints, divine signs. He believed in order so rigid, so absolute, that it broke before it bent. And in the end, his reward was devouring. He tried to become divine, they whispered in corners, in taverns, in brothels and monasteries alike, and became meat for the lowliest creatures. Is that not the oldest story? Kings pretending to be gods, empires pretending to be eternal, power building walls so high it forgets how to kneel. And then, worms. There's something about rot that tells the truth, something about the smell that burns through ceremony, the stench that no incense can drown. It levels the field. It humbles the mighty. It reminds the world you are not beyond the laws of nature, or time, or justice, because even God, it seems, grows tired of theater. So, what are we to do with his story now? A man who sought purity and found infestation. A ruler who thought he could script his way into sainthood only to be rewritten by decay. A corpse so holy no embalmer dared touch him, and so profane no priest dared speak his name aloud. It should feel distant, medieval, mad, but it doesn't. Because even now we crown men in symbols. We surround leaders with ritual and protection and myth. We invent sacred narratives around their authority. We mistake control for virtue. We pray over their images, trust in their speeches, believe their rituals will save us from rot. And when they fall, because they always fall, we act surprised. But it is not surprising, it is inevitable. Because beneath the robes, beneath the crowns, beneath the press releases and painted smiles, all flesh is waiting to fall apart, and every lie told to preserve the illusion makes the fall slower, but so much uglier. So remember Charles, not for his empire, not for his relics, but for the moment when he whispered, with worms in his mouth, "God will not take me whole." And remember what followed, not fire, not thunder, but silence and flies.